Well, top of the morning, everybody. How you guys doing today? My name is Matt Boswell. I am the lighter, lamer version of Brandon Hall. Yeah, that was funny, actually. Of all the things, after Brandon spoke the first week, I probably had 5 different people, even in town, be like, oh, that was funny, that darker, cooler version of you. I'm like, I know, that was so funny, I put it in his annual review to remember it when we get to that juncture. That'll be great. So, anyway, no, Brandon did a great job, and we're going to continue in our series in Colossians. But before we do, I want to remind you, we as a church, we're a group of imperfect people who have been redeemed or rescued. We've been saved by a perfect God. And one of the things that we as Christians do to display the fact that we have entered into that relationship with Jesus is we are baptized. And so we have baptisms coming up just in the next couple of weeks. And so if you're somebody that says, you know what, I want to be baptized, I've given my life to Christ, I believe in Jesus, I haven't been baptized, then man, this is the opportunity for you. And all you need to do is send an email to scott@imrc.org. Or, if that doesn't work, scott@imrc.org. You can also grab me at the front door and say, Matt, I want to get baptized. What do I need to do? And we can put that together right there. But again, baptism is a huge part of how we display that Jesus has marked our lives in a very unique and special way. And so if you have not been baptized, man, this is an opportunity for you. So I want to keep that in mind because, again, imperfect people, but we are redeemed by a perfect God. So I'm going to get underway with prayer. I think that's the best way to start things off. So if you would join me right now, that'd be awesome, and we will get underway. Jesus, I thank you for this particular little letter that Paul wrote to a group of new Christians trying to figure out how they were to be unique or different in the context of their world, how they were to be a culture to the culture that they were in. And that's really the same question that we're begging of ourselves as we go through this little letter. How are we to be that culture that you have set us up to be? How are we to live and think and act and function and care and to do it in a way that truly represents you and is empowered by you? It's not us trying to do it, but it's you doing it in us. And so I pray this morning as we continue in this investigation that you will open our hearts and our minds and our eyes to what it means to rely on you and seek you and depend on you and be then used by you so that we might bless the people around us. And so show us what that means in your good name. Amen. So I was thinking about things this week as it relates to Colossians and this whole series, and probably where I was most focused is the issue of what is it that the world around us most needs to see from us as Christians, right? If there was one singular thing that is super critical, what's that super critical thing that they need to see? And what my walk away was from that, and I was convicted by it because I don't think I embody the thing that they need to see, but what they need to see is a group of people, a culture within the culture that is legitimately different, that we're truly different. Because one of the things we communicate as Christians, at least publicly, what we seek to say is that God changed my life. And I think the thing that sometimes an outsider, when they look at Christians, we say, God changed my life, and they may go like, yeah, man, did he? And maybe if they look at us stereotypically, as evangelical Christians, we say, God changed us. They may be like, I'm not sure I like the change. Right? And I think the dilemma, frankly, is that oftentimes we don't look all that distinct or unique or unanticipated, right? In fact, if anything, we may have the trappings of kind of a lot of our old life, but then with just some new criticisms, right? And yet the hub of Christianity is this idea of grace and truth in tandem. And from that, our changed lives are lives that, because the grace of God has come into our existence in person, it brings a transformation where we submit ourselves to the truth. And as we submit to the truth, we then share that grace with others. And that's what we talked about just a few weeks ago, right? That we share grace, but we live the truth. And yet sometimes maybe what's happened too much is what we've wanted to tell everybody else how to do the truth. And we love our grace. But we haven't made it clear that the grace precedes truth in the sense that there must be grace for truth to then sink deep into our bones. And if it sinks into our bones and we live according to that truth and we do things based on that truth and we love that truth because it brings transformation. I mean, that's what we're really to be known for. And so when we opened up the series, I asked the first question, what does the current Christian culture look like? What does it look like? And I asked that question to all of you openly, and I know many of you had different ideas, and I think when we distill it down, we would say, you know what, I think it's known for a lot of things, but it's probably not known for being that unique or that serendipitous or that generous or that loving or that compassionate or that kind. Now I'm not saying we're not those things. Right? I believe many of us seek to embody those things, but it seems that there is still sort of a gap. And sometimes we seem a little too petty and a little too earthly and a little too critical and maybe a little too hypocritical. And so it seems like there's still something lacking. There's something about where our lives just don't quite embody the fullness of what we would see in the message of the Bible. Now, what my mission is not to do, based on all of what I've just said, is necessarily to sit here and say, here's all the things that we do that we're bad at. My goal is not to rip on us. It's really not. But what I want us to do as we go through Colossians is to be asking that question of, all right, what does Jesus want to do with my life even more? What are things in my life that I know are like boulders in a field that he wants to remove so that I can be more fruitful for him? What are those things that I keep holding on to, those things that I don't think are a big deal, those things that I know get in the way, so that I can then be more surrendered to him so that he might be able to do more than through me? I mean, that's going to be the whole heart. So while we might look and say, this is what Christianity seems to look like in the current culture, we need to go deeper and say, not what does it look like, but what should it look like? Right? What should it look like? What should the average Christian look like in our world? A culture to the culture. See, this is what I love about Colossians because it begins to kind of zero us in on some of those things. And so if I go back to my cooler, darker self 2 weeks ago, what I learned in that is that one of the things that makes the Christian culture unique is that it is rooted in a spirit of thankfulness. Right? Here you have Paul writing a letter to a group of people he's never met. He has no connection, no friendship, no buddies, nothing like that. He's never met them, but he writes to them and he opens up being thankful for what God has done in their lives to these people. Now, Paul is writing this while he's in prison, but he's thankful. And I look at that and I go, man, if we as Christians want to be a culture to the culture and we want to be unique, distinct, different, and show something that's unexpected, you know what we can do? We can be thankful. We can be thankful when life sucks, right? Because life will suck. It'll suck money, it'll suck time, it'll suck health, it'll suck your emotions. Right? Life is going to suck a lot of things constantly. And yet, if we display this thankfulness, even in the midst of the great vacuum of life, sucking everything, that is unique, distinct, different, and people are going to go like, wow, there's something about you. Or I go a step further, even being the types of people in the lives of others where they go, I'm just thankful that you're in my life, being that kind of person. The person that other people are just thankful for. I think about people like Connie Berg. I think about Connie Berg in my world, and I go, I'm just thankful that she's in my world. Everywhere she goes, everybody I meet are just thankful to have a friendship with Connie Berg, right? And there's something about that. Like when you're that kind of person where everybody goes, I'm just thankful that you exist. That is a powerful influencer. That is a powerful catalyst for transformation in our world. And so we as Christians, the first thing we realize as being a culture is that we are a culture of thankfulness. The second thing that maybe will help us to stand out is that we are a culture of prayerfulness. And that's what we looked at last week in Colossians. And in Colossians chapter 1, Paul has this profound prayer that we be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, that you would have a walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to his glorious power for all patience and long-suffering with joy. That's a powerful prayer. We started off 2017 in a message challenging you to memorize that prayer, because it's such a powerful prayer, right? And if we are praying that prayer, God will deliver on that prayer. And I want you to notice the end of the prayer. When you have God's knowledge and you are walking in God's ways and you have God's strength, it says you will have all patience and long-suffering with joy. If you're a patient, long-suffering, joyful person, will you get people's attention in the surrounding culture? Will you be a difference maker if you're patient and long-suffering with joy? Yeah. That's unanticipated. That's attractive. That's different. And if you want to know if you're getting to that place, if you're praying and growing spiritually and getting to the place where you have true patience and long-suffering with joy, you can take this for a test. It's super easy. You find any organization or institution that is highlighted by 3 letters, and you go and see if you still have patience and long-suffering with joy. So you go through the TSA. And at the end, if you have patience and long-suffering with joy, you're growing spiritually. You go to the DMV. At the end of that, you have patience and long-suffering with joy, you're growing spiritually. Call the IRS. At the end of that, if you have patience and long-suffering, you're pretty much sanctified completely. So, right? So there's going to be things in life, in other words, that really press. But if we're growing spiritually, then there's patience, there's long-suffering, there's joy, there's thankfulness, right? This is where we begin to be different. When we're asking the question, how can we be a culture to the culture? How can we be different? We can be different with those things, right? Thankfulness, patience, long-suffering, and joy. Now, here's the challenge I find in this. We can't manufacture those. We can manufacture obeying our morals to some degree, right? We can white-knuckle our way into having that kind of discipline. But these features really do require us to press harder into Christ, right? I mean, I'm not naturally a patient person. I'm not naturally always joy-filled. In fact, if anything, I'm usually pessimistic to be protecting myself, not joyful. Which means it needs to be imparted to me outside of myself. It has to be something where I'm pressing into Christ, and then he then pours into my life in such a way that those features then flow out. Which means it needs to be this daily, sustained, intimate relationship with him. If this stuff is to be transferred into my life from his life, right? There has to be a closeness with him. And so as I thought about this morning and maybe how to kind of get into the topic for the day, I thought there's no better way to do this than a Mad Lib, right? Just a Mad Lib, a simple Mad Lib. I have a statement I want you to fill in the blank on, all right? And this is for all of us. You can just do this in your head if you like. But the challenge for Christians today is that God is too blank. What would you put there? The challenge for Christians today is that God is too blank. Now, there's all kinds of options, right? Some could say God is too soft. That's the problem. Or God is too mean, right? How many maybe right off the bat thought God is too small? Anybody? Few. Did anybody put God is too big? That is the correct answer, Bob. See, I'm going to venture out and say, I do think the problem for us as Christians today is that perhaps maybe our God is too big. And I know that's weird. We can pick a lot of different things, but here's what I mean by that. I think most of us have no problem kind of embracing the immensity of God, right? We don't have, not that our brains can hold it all in, but we have no problem seeing that God's creator, God's master, God's, he established the universe. And from that, there is this tendency, I know in me, to then see God as out there. And he's far away. He's big. He's powerful. But he's that way. He's like the president. He represents me. He's going to do bigly things for me, right? But I don't know him. I'm on this coast. He's on that coast. He doesn't know my name, really. But he does stuff that affects my life every day. But there's no closeness. So he's big. And sometimes the bigness causes us to forget that he is also small, close, near, and intimate, that he wants those things. Because what I've realized is if God was more small in my world, then it would cause me to look at my world in very different ways. I would make very different decisions if he seemed more close and more real. There would be private decisions that I would make that I would not make if I really believed he was near, close, watching, hanging out with me, going, you sure you want to do that? That's not a good idea. But instead I go, no, he's way out there. He's like wherever Thor lives, right? That's where he's at. And I think that is the challenge for us, is that God is just sometimes too big. He's out there, he's not right here. And so Paul, as he's opening up this letter, having dealt with thankfulness and prayerfulness, wants to then kind of get into some declarational ideas about who Jesus really is. And this church needs it because they're still a little shaky on who Jesus is in their lives. And so he's going to have this very potent, very tight series of ideas about Jesus, reminding us that he is, yes, big, and also he is small. He is out there. And he's right here. And from that, we need to embrace the full range of who he is. So if you have a Bible, please, right now, or a Bible app, you can open up to the book of Colossians chapter 1. We're going to be starting in verse 15. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. It opens with the word he, and that is Jesus, based on what we've read coming into this little section. And it says something profound, starting with the bigness. It says, he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God. Just that statement is weird. Because if it's invisible, there's no image. Right? It's like, what's Wonder Woman's invisible jet look like? I don't know, bro. It's invisible, But suddenly, the invisible jet becomes visible. And you go, oh, sweet jet. Right? This is what Jesus does. He comes into the world as God made visible. And so this is one of the things about our Christian culture that we want to embrace, and it can be a little uncomfortable, but what do we believe? We believe Jesus is God. I had a construction worker come to my house the other day because they're doing some work on some stuff. He walks in, sees a sign over our window. It says, this house believes. He says, what's this house believe? He said, this house believes that Jesus is God. And he goes, amen, brother. I'm like, okay, now I know the turf we're on. All right, so, right? But that's how simple it is. This is what we believe. We don't believe Jesus is simply a great philosophical person, a good guy, a great teacher, a role model, a philosophy system. We believe Jesus is God. He takes the God who is so immense and unknowable and makes him knowable. Right? He reduces down for us the immensity of God into a bite-sized understanding that we can relate to and we can embrace. Right? And I think that's critical because, again, you think about just the immensity of who God is. That's a unique thing to be able to then take that brilliance and then make it easy enough for us mere mortals to to wrestle with and to appreciate and to know and to walk with. But that's what Jesus does. And so Paul starts big. Jesus is God, right? More than that, he says he is the firstborn over all creation, which means even though he is God made visible, he still retains his authority. Some people get all weirded out when they see this little phrase here, firstborn, right? They're like, so was Jesus made? No, that's not the culture. And was he the firstborn and then there was a second one? And was that Lucifer? Because that'd be weird if that was his brother. No, firstborn is not like the way we see it here, like birth order. In their culture, it was an heir. It was somebody that had all of the authority of their father. And so Paul says Jesus is God, and Jesus has all the authority of God. And so as Christians, we just realize that one of the things we have to embrace, even though it may sound weird at times, is when people say, who do you think Jesus is? We think Jesus is God. We think Jesus is God. And as God, he did something very amazing. He then also was creator. It says, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Our previous series was the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 starts off by saying, in the beginning, God created. Now we're in Colossians chapter 1. What's it say? In the beginning, Jesus created. If you like formal logic, you have a premise, and a conclusion. Premise, God created. Premise, Jesus created. Conclusion, Jesus is God. That's why we believe it. Right? Jesus is God. And what I really dig about this is that it counts that he created both realms. The seen realm and the unseen realm. So all of this other realm that we call heaven, right, is a culture to itself. And he created that culture and that infrastructure and that entire society. And then he creates the universe that we know. He did all of it. And it says he did this through himself and for himself. And I dig that because it forces me to be reflective, right? I found myself asking the question, why do I want to create anything? Or why do we create? Right? Because if he created for himself, some people say, well, that sounds selfish. But I'm like, why do I create? Like, why do we create gardens or flower beds? Or why do we do things in our yard or create machines or whatever you might create code for software, whatever. You create because you know what? It's fun to explore. It's fun to display. It's fun to see beauty. It's fun to exercise your abilities in such a way that you see something established that wasn't there before. It's just whimsical. It's nice. It's pleasant. It's all of those things combined. And so it reminds me that God isn't, even though he's got all the distant big power, he exercises it in the sense of hands-on craftsmanship, hands-on delight. You see this even in Proverbs chapter 8, where there was just, you see the creativity of God in forging the universe, and it just seems playful. Playful. And there's some real truth to the fact that when we create, there is a playfulness to it. And so it was done through him, and it was done for him. But then Paul says something that is truly mind-boggling. He says, and in him all things hold together. In him, in Jesus, all things hold together. Now, I'll tell you what I think is so great about this little snippet. I call it a biblical time bomb, right? It's a biblical time bomb because as human development advances, we learn more about what that little verse entails. It's not like, oh, it was said 2,000 years ago, oh, it's old hat, man. No, it's like the more we learn, the more we learn. So to try to illustrate this, I was really fighting with this one. This like, how do I really dig into what this is? I'm like, I need to employ something that's academic and illustrative and potent. And so I decided to go with the Guardians of the Galaxy. I figured that was going to help me out a ton. And so you look at the Guardians of the Galaxy. This is, again, the most academic illustration I could ever come up with right here. And you look, you go, what do they all have in common other than various shades of color, What they all have in common, every Guardian of the Galaxy, is they all have this common component that we call in science DNA. All of them. In fact, Baby Groot, let's look at Baby Groot. Oh, I love Baby Groot. Baby Groot at his core is made up of DNA, right? Now we have a little slide here for DNA that kind of gives us a sense of things. Here's what's so incredible about this, right? So if you really start to dig on science, you'll dig on this. All life as we know it, right? Made of cells. Cells, chromosomes. Chromosomes have inside DNA. 4 letters represent that. T, A, G, and C, right? So just 4 letters. These are chemical compounds, 4 letters. And God writes all life based on 4 letters. Imagine if I went to you and said, here's your homework assignment. You need to write an entire book. You can only use 4 letters of the alphabet. You'd have a very dull book, right? God, however, only needs a 4-letter alphabet to do this, right? So you just have these 4 simple codes, and they get swapped in different order, and it's the difference between Star-Lord and Baby Groot. It's the difference between a tree in your yard and your dog. It's just moving the letters in this code. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that's how this whole thing works. It's predicated on this code. Now, let's go a little deeper, though, thinking about this, right? We look at DNA and we go, oh, okay, so it's the building blocks of life, everything else. Well, more fundamentally, it is a storage device. It's like a thumb drive. It's a simple thumb drive. But if you took 1 gram of DNA, just 1, it actually would hold about 700,000 gigabytes of data. Now, the computer nerds get it. The rest of us are like, oh, I don't know what that means, right? So let me put that in perspective. So 1 gram of DNA. I've got my smartphone here. I'm not as cool as some of you. Mine only has 16 gigabytes of storage data on this. But if I was to take all of that storage data and put it into 1 gram of DNA, it would take about 48,000 iPhones to hold the information that's in 1 gram of DNA. If you reduce that to a different level, that's about 140,000 high-definition videos that you could put on that. Or, for some of you music fans, 165 million songs. Right? 165 million songs on 1 gram of DNA. Right? In other words, this designer decided to come up with a storage device that is more potent than anything we can develop. In fact, I was just reading an article a couple of weeks ago where Microsoft is currently working on how they are storing data on DNA. Weird, right? Right? And it's just at the rudimentary level, but they're like, if we can tap this, man, now it just becomes limitless what you can do because it's so much information stored in such a small space. Right? So when you start to boil down to the real small stuff, it gets completely fascinating. Now, here's what's even weirder about DNA. All of life, right, it is built on this, but if you look at what DNA is built on, let's go to the next slide. It's built out of this wonderful thing of the periodic table of elements. If you don't understand what the periodic table is, it's basically God's Lego bin, right? So you got the little 1 peg piece and the 2 peg pieces and 3 peg and 4 peg and 5 peg, and that's just really no different than the periodic table of elements. And DNA is made up of 5 of the elemental table. So hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. I mean, it's not made up of much. So here's what's strange. All of life is built on the foundation of those 5 elements. And by the way, those 5 elements, they're not alive. So God does something truly amazing, which is he takes inanimate things and produces life from them. He couples them together in such a way and then arranges them in such a way and goes through a process in such a way that from nothing that is living, he creates everything that is living. Right? Out of his Legos. Right? We're getting small. Let's get smaller, though. Let's go to carbon. Let's just look at carbon. That's a 6-pegged Lego. All right? Carbon is fascinating just because, again, it can be put together in different ways. If you make the atoms really, really tight, you get a diamond. If they're loose, you get graphite. In between there, you get Baby Groot. All right? So God can take a 6-peg Lego, but do a lot more with the 6-peg Lego than I can. right? Just spacing them. He can do different things, right? So he can do that. So if we take, though, this carbon atom and we break it down even further, right? We bust it out and take out the electron, don't need that. We looked at the nucleus and say, okay, well, that's a proton there. Inside a proton, there's a lepton and there's quarks and things like that. What we've done in science is we've taken these and we've sent them at high speeds and slammed them together to find out what's the smallest thing in the universe. What is the golden super Lego, right? That makes everything. And just recently, just in the last few years, we finally came to the conclusion. We saw it in the math. We needed to see the evidence and everything else. And it's that little green-looking thing called a Higgs boson, right? It's just this little particle, but it's amazing because it's a particle that gives everything else its mass. Right? So it makes all the stuff different stuff. It's why gold is gold and lead is lead and copper is copper and everything else, because this little thing kind of dictates what everything else is and becomes. We go, so that's the core of it all. And then science said, well, no, not exactly, because Higgs saw this other thing. He saw a thing called the Higgs field, right? And the Higgs field is an energy field that surrounds all living things. No, that's the force. You can bring up that next slide. The Higgs field is actually an energy field that surrounds everything. It's like the syrup of the universe, right? And there's a relationship between the Higgs boson and the Higgs field. And then some other theories called superstring theory that make everything. What was crazy, you can go back to that last slide, I'm sorry. Science decided to call that Higgs boson the God particle. Kind of weird, right? For a field that's not terribly interested in him, they sure like to use his name for this, right? Now here, go back to the other slide, the one with the strings and everything else. I look at all of this, right? And I see all of this relationship where basically, and it's still in its theoretical stage, but at the theoretical level, science is saying, you know what, we really look at the universe and we think the whole universe is built on the foundation of nothing more than little vibrating strings of energy or data, information, that then informs the Higgs boson, which then informs all other elements in the periodic table to give them mass, so all stuff isn't the same stuff and everything else. And so in the last 5 years, they've come to this conclusion that there is this thing in the universe that holds it all together. And then Paul's like, wait a minute, bro, I said that 2,000 years ago. Now, this is why I say that it's a time bomb verse. Because the more we learn, the more we understand, the more, it doesn't drive us away from God, it drives us toward God. I had an interesting discussion with an atheist about the Higgs boson. Well, actually, it was about God. He says, God doesn't exist. I said, why? And he goes, the Higgs boson proved God doesn't exist. I'm like, the thing you called the God particle? And he goes, yeah. And I go, we don't even understand it. How can it have suddenly erased God? You know, and so we had an interesting dialogue about this. But at the core of it, I look and I go, it does just the opposite for me. It brings me back to a verse like this, that in him all things hold together, right? Now, another thing, maybe as an additive for us as Christians, this is why we should be in the science fields. This is why we should engage instead of disengage. We get to see God more, not God less. You know, that's maybe one of the tragic things is sometimes maybe we haven't been as encouraging of those fields as we should be. And so we feel like, oh, there's no place for God in it. No, there's tons of place for God in it because God is the ultimate physicist and mathematician and botanist and biologist and architect. He did it all. And so his bigness is displayed all through creation when we look and just kind of sift scientifically to see his handiwork. Because in him all things, they hold together, right? Now what's cool is that no sooner does Paul say, man, he is God, he is creator, that he instantly drives from this immensity to intimacy. He goes from the cosmic to the community, from this big idea to a little idea, that he's both creator and then suddenly he is also pastor, verse 18. No sooner does he say he created everything, it holds together. He says, and he is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether in earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So the same God who was and is mathematician, physicist, botanist, biologist, chemist, geologist, everything else, that same God then comes and decides to become very personal and very intimate. And so while I think creation proclaims God, the arrival of Christ proves that God seeks to connect with his people, to know us and to invest into us and to care for us. That's why it says to reconcile all things to himself. This means he's also counselor and emissary and friend. He seeks to bring unity where there is disunity. Seeks to reconnect relationship where it's been fractured and lost. I mean, that's his mission. And he did this, it says, by the blood of his cross. So the Creator stoops to the ultimate level and says, I will be slain by my creation. I am king, but I'll come as slave. I create life. Yes, I take 4 little letters. I combine them in different ways out of 5 elements, all held together by superstring theory and the Higgs boson. I do all of that, and yet also I'm going to come and I'm going to die. As the author of life, I'm going to die. I'm going to do that so that I can be connected with my creation. And not just us kind of generically, but you specifically. Look what he says in verse 21. And you, right? So it goes from the church to, and you, Matt Boswell. Or you, Gray Boswell, or Emma Boswell, or Honor Boswell, soon to be Pratt, right? And you were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. But he has reconciled in his body of his flesh by his death. He's reconciled you in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. See, a true friend is there even when you're not acting like a true friend. And that's what Jesus is to us. Not only is he creator, not as a God creator and pastor, he's friend. He's friend. And he stepped into our lives when we weren't very good friends to him. In fact, we were enemies. And we were doing our own thing. And last night I had a real sleepless night. Didn't have a reason to have a sleepless night, just did. And I found myself backtracking through my life. It was a terrible journey. All the bad things that I had done. It was so weird. I don't even know why that happened. But all the way back to like elementary school, you know what I mean? I felt like Chunk and the Goonies. And when I was 8, I did this thing. You know, like I felt like that. Like I was just walking through times where I was mean to people and times that I didn't exercise honesty or whatever else, you know. And then it just kind of hits me that, you know, sometimes we think we're pretty good, but when you really kind of walk back, you go, man, I've done a lot of really foolish, sinful, awful things. And yet he reconciled in his body all of my evil deeds, my hostile mind, right? He stepped in and dealt with all of it. And so this is great because, again, it shows that Jesus moved from his distant bigness to personal smallness for us, to transform us, to change us, to have us be a culture for the culture, to be a group of people, a body of people that embody what is important to him. And what is that? It says holiness and blamelessness and above reproach. Holy just means to be uncommon. That we would be uncommon in our world. That's where I go back to the thesis of this whole thing, the culture to the culture. What's uncommon? Thankfulness is uncommon, right? Patience is uncommon. Long-suffering is uncommon. Joy's uncommon. Reasonableness nowadays is uncommon. Kindness is uncommon. Sensitivity and thoughtfulness for those who may oppose us, that's uncommon. We call that loving our enemies, but it's uncommon. We live in a culture that is cited up everywhere. And I think it is a prime opportunity then for us to be like, okay, then how can I be uncommon in that? What's uncommon is I crossed the border from my group to their group to let them know I care. I live the truth and I share with them the grace. And I pray that the grace would touch their lives, and from that they would then live according to the truth. I mean, that's our heart. But boy, that would be uncommon. It's easy to dislike somebody on the other side of something where you disagree. It's tough to love them even in the disagreement and to close in on them. But that's exactly what Jesus did for us. He closed in on us when we were in disagreement with him. He reconciled us so that we might be like him. And being like him, first of all, is being holy, which means to be uncommon. Or blameless, trustworthy. I read an article about a month and a half ago that pastors are dropping in the ranks of trustworthiness in culture. It used to be like, you could always trust the pastor in town. Now it's like, I think it's like pastors and lawyers and used car salesmen are like all on the same strata, which if you're selling cars or a lawyer, I'm not trying to throw you into the bus. We're in a group together now. But it's like, well, how did that happen? Well, I can think of some things. I can think of some scandals and some, mishandling of money or relational issues, all kinds of things that pastors have done to kind of earn the lack of trust. But see, here Jesus says, I want to produce in you, right, this whole thing in which you are blameless, you're trustworthy. And then above reproach means esteemed, right? Esteemed. The people who look and go, yeah, that's good people. See, I keep saying I got to write this article where 20 years ago, Christians were the moral majority. We're now the immoral minority. And what I mean by that is the culture around us sort of looks and says, you guys are not as loving as the rest of us. You guys are not as accepting as the rest of us. You guys are actually maybe a little bit dangerous at times because you're bigoted unlike the rest of us. And so we suddenly find ourselves in this minority category and in a immoral minority category. And I can't help but look at that and say, well, great, then what do we need to do to be at least above reproach by crossing the line, showing our humanity, not just posting a statement or retweeting an article, but being those people that disrupt the stereotype, right? Being above reproach. See, all of this to me sounds daunting. Feels impossible almost. And as I think about it more, I've come to the conclusion that says, I know what this means. It means Jesus has to be small. He just has to be small. And what I, again, keep going back to on that is he has to be in the proximity of my space. He has to be in my head space. He has to be in my heart space. He has to be one that I am daily saying, Jesus, be closer to me because I know I cannot do this. Holy Spirit, I cannot do this. You have to do it in me. I do not have this mind. You've got to give me that mind. I don't have that heart. You've got to give me that heart. I don't have the patience, and I don't have the long suffering, and I don't have the joy in my own strength. He says, you're right, but boy, you press into me, and I will pour out through you. And that is the key. I believe this is why Paul opens up after he gives a thankfulness and prayerfulness speech. He goes right into who Jesus is, because when we see who Jesus is, man, that shapes us as God, as creator, as pastor, and as friend. And how do we display that we're in it with him? Paul says in verse 23, if indeed. He's saying, man, you want to know, you really know Christ, you're truly saved, you have a relationship with him, then things are going to come out in your life, and the proximity is going to only increase that more like a flywheel, right? It's going to get it spinning faster and faster. That's where he says, if indeed you continue in the faith, this shows that you're a truly saved person. If you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed to all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Jesus didn't leave the workshop, his chemistry lab, his physics lab, simply to come and say, all right, you're saved. No, he came to touch our lives, to shape us, to transform us, and then from that to deploy us for his purposes, right? And so from that it means he needs to be small, he needs to be needed, he needs to be near, so that we might take our steps in him. Now this morning, we're big on the idea of taking steps. In fact, every Sunday at Redemption, we hope that our heart is to be encouraging people to be taking different steps. And if you have our app, and by the way, it is totally okay to use a phone at Redemption Church. We encourage you to use a phone at Redemption Church because it is the way that we communicate with you, you communicate with us. And so I've pulled up our app right here. And on our app, we're doing this every week. We have next steps. And we encourage you to utilize this because there's different steps for different people. And we want to know what your next steps are so we can be encouragement to you, so we can be praying for you and understand maybe what's going on in your world. And so for some of you in the room today, your next step, you go, you know what, I know that I am not following Jesus. I've never followed Jesus. I've never known Jesus. And maybe your next step is to follow him. Say, I get it. He's creator. He's God. He's pastor. He's friend. He did this to reconcile me. I want more of him. So if your step today is say, I want to follow Jesus, I encourage you just to click follow Jesus on that next step tile and then hit send, and we're going to see that. Hit submit, we're going to see that. For others of you, maybe it's, I need to refocus my life around Jesus, and that's probably a bigger group of us. Where we know we just haven't been as focused as we want to be, we should be, we desire to be, and we feel it. We go, I know I'm not long-suffering. I know I'm not patient. I know I'm not joyful. I know I'm not thankful always. I know I'm not that different. I have the same fears, anxieties, frustrations, and fatigues as everybody else, and yet Jesus promises things that I don't experience. I need to get reoriented around Jesus. Maybe that's your next step, and you go, man, that is what I'm deciding today. Or maybe for some of us, it's just saying, you know what, for the next 7 days, I'm going to pray, Jesus, be closer to my life. And that's your next step. That's what I'm going to commit to. Next 7 days, I'm going to take every day. I'm going to say, Jesus, I just want you to be closer because I know when you're closer, I'm different. When you're further from me, which is really about our movement, not his, then we don't sense his potency and his power. There's next step for everybody, right? Because we're all on the journey of next steps because we're all followers of Jesus who's always on the move. Jesus is never stationary. He's always on the move because he's always seeking to grow us and shape us and transform us because he saved us to be a culture. Let's pray together. Jesus, I thank you for your word, for your wisdom, for your goodness. And I pray that we are just desperate for you. I'm not praying that we go do a bunch of stuff. That's the hardest part about this. I'm praying that we're dependent on a bunch of stuff. And that from that you do that in us. And so we look to you, we love you, and we thank you in your perfect name. Amen.